Supply and demand are the two forces that drive the market process. But what are they? And how do changes in supply and demand change the prices of goods and services? Let's look at demand using the Steam store as an example. We'll assume that when games on Steam cost $60, consumers will collectively purchase 20 games. If Steam were to sell their games at $20 each instead, then consumers would purchase 100 games. If we figure out how many games would be purchased at any given price, we can create our demand curve. Any change in the price of games on Steam will cause the quantity of games demanded to shift along the demand curve. What does this look like from the supply side, from Steam's side? Well, we'll assume that if Steam could sell games for $80 each, then they would be motivated to provide 100 new games. If, however, Steam can only sell games for $20 each, then they'll only be motivated to provide 40 new games. If we can figure out how many new games Steam would be willing to provide for any given price, we can draw out the supply curve. The more that Steam can sell each game for, the more motivated they will be to provide new games. Now, let's add in our supply curve and our demand curve to the same graph. The point at which the two curves meet is called equilibrium. In equilibrium, the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are in harmony. When the price is at equilibrium, consumer and producer surplus is maximized. But what happens if there's a change in supply? Some of the things that can affect the supply curve are labor costs. How much does a company have to pay its employees to produce goods and services? How much capital goods, like the servers Steam uses to store its data, cost, natural resource costs, and entrepreneurship, or innovation. If one of these costs increase, it will cause the entire supply curve to shift to the left. This will cause the equilibrium price to increase and the quantity demanded to decrease. If, on the other hand, the supply costs decrease, whether it's due to a decrease in the cost of a related good, a new innovation, or some other factor, the supply curve will shift to the right. This shift to the right will cause the equilibrium price to decrease and the quantity demanded to increase. Now, let's look at changes in demand. The consumer demand for a good or service is based on 5 things: consumer income, or how much money consumers have to spend on goods and services, the population of consumers that can be supplied, consumer tastes, or the things that consumers value most, consumer expectations for future price changes, and, finally, the cost of alternative or substitute goods. If, for example, it is discovered that playing Steam games is good for your health, the total demand for games will increase. This will cause a rightward shift in the demand, leading to an increase in the cost and quantity demanded for games. If, on the other hand, the cost of going to a movie become cheaper, the demand for games will decrease. This will cause a leftward shift in the demand curve, resulting in a decrease in the quantity demanded and the price of games. Now, sometimes the government will decide that the equilibrium price for a good, say Steam games, isn't fair to the producer. To fix the problem, the government will set a minimum price for games to be sold at. This is called a price floor. Some other examples of price floors are government subsidies, fair trade goods, and a minimum wage. The price floor causes consumers to demand less of the good than they would at equilibrium. But since the price is higher than it would be at equilibrium, producers are incentivized to produce more of the good to sell at the higher price. This gap between quantity demanded and quantity supplied is called a surplus. In the case of minimum wage, this means there are more people that want to work than companies willing to employ them. This means it's harder for the workers to find a job than if the price was at equilibrium, since the competition is increased. Now, the price floor does help out the producers and causes an increase in producer surplus, but it reduces the amount of consumer surplus. And since the price isn't at equilibrium, some of the total possible surplus is lost. This lost surplus or value is called a deadweight loss. At other times, the government might decide that the price at equilibrium is actually unfair to consumers. To help out consumers, the government will introduce a maximum price that the good or service can be sold at. This is called a price ceiling. Some examples of a price ceiling are rent control, anti-gouging laws that prevent suppliers from raising prices on goods like food and water after a natural disaster, or any other form of price cap. When a price ceiling is introduced, consumers demand more given the lower price. Producers, on the other hand, supply less than they would at equilibrium, since the price is lower. The gap between the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded is called a shortage. More people want to buy the good than there are goods available. This leads to alternative methods of rationing that don't involve the price of a good, such as waiting in long lines to purchase food and water after a hurricane. The price ceiling does help out the consumers by increasing the total consumer surplus, but it comes at the cost of producer surplus. Since the price isn't at equilibrium, the total possible surplus, or value, isn't created. This lost value is called a deadweight loss.